welcome, Natalie. Lovely to meet you. Thank you for being here. So your latest book is actually The Red Hollow, but I feel like before we chat about that, we need to really touch on Needless Alley, and we kind of need to set the scene. So that introduces us to private inquiry agent William Garrett. I just wondered, can you tell us a little bit about the idea behind William's character and the inspiration behind the story?
Needless Alley was the result of a creative writing MA, and we had a visiting lecturer, a very famous crime writer, who was really engaging, a really excellent speaker, and he said that the United Kingdom doesn't have a tradition of private detective fiction. Most of our detectives are kind of amateurs like Poirot or Miss Marple, or police officers like Morse. Because in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, we did not have private detectives in the UK. And I remember thinking, I'm not too sure if that's quite right, because I'm a massive fan of old movies. And I'm a massive fan of 1930s detective fiction. And I do remember that there is a 1950s Agatha Christie where there is a private detective. And I came home and I spoke to my husband about this, and I said, I'm not too sure this famous crime writer was right. And he went, no, famous crime writer was wrong. We did have lots of private detectives, but they only did divorce work. And I thought, oh gosh, that would make a private detective like the anti-Philip Marlow. Philip Marlow, you probably know your detective fiction, but if you don't, Philip Marlow is Raymond Chandler's detective from the first Marlow book was The Big Sleep, 1939, and Marlow never did divorce work. He only did more interesting work. He never did divorce work. And I thought, well, let's create the anti-Philip Marlow. And I was a massive fan of Raymond Chandler anyway, and I read quite intensively, not just Raymond Chandler's work, but also his essays and crime writing. And the more I sort of looked at his creation and looked at his philosophy behind the creation, the more I realised who I wanted William to be. And in the beginning of Needless Alley, there is a quotation from Chandler, down these mean streets a man must go who is not himself mean. And that is William, my detective, summed up. So he has a grubby backstreet office in Needless Alley in the centre of Birmingham. He takes on divorce work. That's his main job. But interestingly, while I was researching the novel and also watching Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers films, I realised that these guys also, they would employ a gigolo to entrap women, because the only way you could get a divorce in the 1930s is if you had proof of adultery, and you would present that proof of adultery in court of law. And Chandler himself called these men dirty little men poking about in hotel corridors. That's William's job. Oftentimes, if you wanted a divorce, and it was a kind of amicable divorce, you just weren't getting on and there was no adultery, then you could employ a gigolo to have photos taken with your wife in the hotel bedroom. And these private detectives, along with kind of slightly shady lawyers, would organise all of that for you. And there is a novel published at the time, which was a campaigning novel, which I can't remember the name of, a campaigning novel which goes into detail about this, written by a lawyer, a solicitor, who was really angry about the kind of injustice of the divorce laws. And that's where I started the research into 1930s divorce law, the research into what a British private inquiry agent would do. And therefore, William and his friend Ronnie, who's incredibly handsome, effectively entrap women into adultery so their rich husbands can get divorces. And of course, when you think about that as a crime writer and as a lover of a genre of crime writing called noir, that gives you lots of possibilities to write about the darker side of human behaviour. And that's how I started.
Brilliant, thank you. And you've already just alluded to it, but it feels like the story really took you down a research rabbit hole in that respect, particularly in terms of the local history of Birmingham. Do you enjoy that part of the writing process?
Yeah, that's my favourite part of the writing process, I think. With Needless Alley in particular, I spent weeks in rabbit holes, research rabbit holes. I absolutely adore going on the National Newspaper Archive. It's such a wonderful insight into that world. And you could, so for example, on the National Newspaper Archive, you could put in a keyword and it would come up, if you're looking for articles about badgers, then there will be articles about badgers from the 1750s in the National Newspaper Archive. So it's just such a wonderful way of researching your period. But with the National Newspaper Archive, I found all sorts of shady history about Needless Alley itself. It has a fantastic history, and that's why it's so famous in Birmingham. The history of it is remarkable. And I also looked at the BFI. I went to the BFI and looked at old newsreels that showed Birmingham in the 1930s. So I researched, it was wonderful, old maps. I walked a lot. So the research was the best bit.
Was there anything that surprised you or you didn't know that you do now? That's one big thing.
Oh, well, yeah, and I think we've got the time to tell the story. There was how am I going to describe it politely? A house of ill repute in Needless Alley called the Grand Sultan Divan. I think it was around in the mid-Victorian period, perhaps about the 1860s, 1870s. And it was there was one in Manchester as well, a Grand Sultan Divan in Manchester. And it was advertised in the Birmingham Mail, I think, as it sold ices, so ice cream, cigars. It was a dance hall and a bowling alley, American-style bowling alley. And it was called the Grand Sultan Divan. It was run by a man called Joseph Baldano and his wife Kate, who previously was a madam from Liverpool. And when they married, she came into the marriage with something like £2,000 or £3,000, which was an awful lot of money in those days. And the marriage wasn't working. And she said, I want to leave you and I want to take my money. And he said, absolutely not. So Kate and her fancy man, who was a travelling salesman, it's sort of turning into a joke now, drugged Joseph Baldano, drugged his brandy of the evening, robbed his safe, and went to Llandudno. Ran away to Llandudno, and it was a massive scandal because she'd robbed his safe and she'd run away, and then all of the stuff about prostitution came out, and then she dropped him. There were jewels in there as well that didn't belong to her, so she dropped those. And I thought, oh my goodness, there's such a lovely story there, and interestingly, it's about divorce. And I didn't know that before I was writing Needless Alley, that the kind of the divorce laws were so, there's this kind of thread of failed marriages. But what was absolutely fascinating about it was that the fancy man was prosecuted for theft, but Kate wasn't prosecuted because by law you couldn't rob your husband. So she got away with it. Because she was like his property, and your property can't rob you because they're property. And I just love that story so much. And it's there in the back of my head that the Grand Sultan Divan existed. Oh, and the people who bought it, when Joseph Baldano became bankrupt, it was the YMCA. It became Birmingham YMCA. So it kind of went from one kind of really louche nightclub, house of ill repute because of Kate's previous job, I imagine, to like, I think in the Birmingham Post it was described as a great place for young men to get together and do wholesome activities. But yeah, that was a lovely fact.
That's one of the greatest things about, when you start going and start diving into things like that, is the history that you come up with, and also places that you've grown up with as well, that all of a sudden, these places you walk past and you never knew what they were. So yeah, brilliant. The women in the story, they do have quite a hard time of it, which is kind of reflective of the attitudes of the era, and maybe in spite of or because of this, they're really feisty and fearless. And you write with great honesty about those situations. Was one of the aims in the story to give them a voice, particularly in terms of the period you were setting in?
Yeah, absolutely. My main character is a male. Is male, not a male. Is male. So I'm writing from a male point of view, which is very interesting. Actually, it's not. I think if I was a man, what would I think? And then that's it, I do it. So all of William's kind of weirdness, his trauma, the fact that he really likes modern poetry, that's down to me. But simultaneously, I wanted this to be absolutely a story about women and women's lives. With the genre I write in, and I do write in the literary end of the genre, but the genre I write in sees women's trauma, the exploitation of women, violence against women as entertainment. And oftentimes, the dead woman is simply a plot device to move the story forward, to get the male detective detecting. Not necessarily so much now. We often have this kind of strong female detective, don't we? But I did not want my murdered woman to be inhuman. I wanted to give that woman a personality, a voice, her humanity. And that's why I kind of broke a golden rule. There's no murder in Needless Alley until I think a third of the way through, because I wanted my victims to be real people. And that was very important to me. But I also wanted to reflect women's lives. And I don't believe that people have substantially changed. I think humanity and human nature is pretty much constant. Our society changes at a glacial pace, really. I think when my mum was married, I think perhaps my dad had to co-sign her when she wanted the bank account. I mean, and that's the 1970s, that a man had to act as your guarantor if you wanted to access finances. I think rape within marriage was legal until 98, and I was married in 96. So these things are not disappeared. And women have been enduring, I suppose, inequalities and violence and sadness for a very long time. And I wanted to give voice to that, but not in a kind of boo-hoo way. There's a remarkable strength and endurance to women. You get a group of women in a room and they know each other and they love each other, and it's like a coven. That's why we were persecuted back in the day, because, you get a group of women, particularly of a certain age, in a room, and we're just telling it like it is. So there's a real strength and endurance to women, and I wanted to really honour that. And honour young women now and what they're going through now. I don't think too much has changed. I still think young women are going through an awful lot now, and young men obviously, but young women are going through and have to put up with an awful lot.
I think it's interesting the way you write the men, though, as well, because they sort of do start to question some of their attitudes, don't they? So they grow a conscience almost throughout it. So where the parts of the where they're going through the divorce and the honey trap parts of it, and William starts to question what he's doing, as does Ronnie and his part in it too. So it's that dynamic is interesting in the stories too. But all the characters really in Needless Adderley have incredible stage presence, so it's really easy to form a picture of them in your mind. But for me, it's Queenie that really stands out for me. She's just a stoic, matriarchal powerhouse of a woman. She's still, still young, but it feels like she's lived 100 lives. And I feel like we all know a Queenie. I think every one of us would know one. So I just wondered if she was based on anyone or where the idea for her came from.
So I never planned to write Queenie. She was never a planned character.
That's amazing. I can't believe that.
I know. It was so. I'll give away a spoiler, but when William discovers that Clara and Ronnie are dead, I thought, well, what's going to happen now? Because I kind of half planned the novel, but I'm a baby writer, so you kind of learn as you write. And I thought, what's going to happen next? And I thought, oh, he's going to go to the Canal Basin because Ronnie's sister runs a narrowboat. And then I kind of channeled her like I was psychic. But what I actually realised I was doing was drawing on family history. So Queenie is very loosely based on my grandma. So Queenie's voice is my grandma's voice. But the character of Queenie is based on my great-grandma. So I had a great-grandma who's, I always say one of 11, but it's actually one of 13. She was one of 13. She was born on a narrowboat in West Bromwich. And she hauled coal from the Staffordshire, North Warwickshire coalfields into Birmingham. And she married very young. She married at 16 to my granddad, who was a World War I soldier, just out of, just finished with, and he was gassed. They settled in Coventry, but my great-grandfather was a massive wrong-un criminal. And she helped him run his criminal enterprises. And when he died, effectively, of the gas from World War I, she carried on. And she was in prison twice. And my mum has all of her letters, and they're just amazing. They're really feisty. There's one where she came out of prison, and then she went to the pub, and people were blanking her, and she was so outraged. She was like, and nobody offered me a drink. And I saw so-and-so, and she turned her back on me, and I was absolutely, and I know all about her. And it was that kind of really gossipy outrage in these letters, but also real strength of character, because I don't think she would have been able to do what she did without being a strong woman. But the voice is my grandmother. It's absolutely my grandmother, and sometimes me. I feel I'm very softly spoken, quite a gentle person, but I do have this kind of inner voice of outrage, and it's a kind of very working class voice as well, where I'm like I might as well be on Coronation Street being outraged all the time, and it's just like this inner voice, and that's Queenie. So she's partly my great-grandma, but she's my grandma's voice, and she's a little bit me as well. I've never really admitted that, but she's a little bit me.
Well, she's a fantastic character. And was it the adding the Birmingham canals in, was that something that you just knew from the start you were going to put some action on and around the canals? Was it important for you to feature that as part of Birmingham's history?
Obviously it's part of Birmingham's history, but it's also part of the Midlands history. So, and the country's history, really. I'm old enough to know the canals when they weren't rejuvenated and a place of commerce. I'm old enough to know that you weren't allowed to go on them or be near them. And that was always my childhood. Just don't go near the canal, don't go down the canal. And my grandparents would tell me stories about the canal that were absolutely horrific. And so it must have been in the back of my mind. I've just very recently said that my whole life is like a compost. So these stories my grandparents told me, my own experiences, what I've read, the music I listen to, art, poetry, that's the compost, and the flower is the book. So yeah, when I was a child, the canal really loomed large, and my granddad, this is coming on to the Red Hollow really, but my paternal granddad told me a story, horrific stories about what happened in the Coventry Canal, and I think that came out in both novels.
We've learnt an interesting fact today about the Birmingham canals. Apparently there's more canals in than there are in Venice, is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And they're not as deep as you think. And also, they became reasonably tidal in the Victorian period. Weirdly tidal. So obviously the canal boats would work to a timetable, and when they were all coming in to deliver the coal, the canal would rise and rise and rise. So it was sort of like you could see the canal boats were coming before you could see them in the distance, because the canal water would be rising in the basin, yeah.
Now, that takes us very nicely actually onto the Red Hollow, but this is a little bit different, isn't it? Because the action takes place slightly outside of the city. So again, could you just tell us a little bit about what William is investigating in this story?
So with Needless Alley, I was looking at the city. I was exploring the city and what it meant to be a person who lived in the city and those inequalities. And I was really thinking about Raymond Chandler, because he said that what he liked about Los Angeles was that there were kind of gangsters and bootleggers, and the judges would send the bootleggers to jail, but they would also have a cellar of bootlegged whiskey at their home. So there are lots of complexities about criminality and class that can be explored in a city as large as Birmingham, and I really loved that. And that's a very kind of an American idea. That's American crime fiction. But of course, British crime fiction, the British tradition, is the country house mystery, where a significant number of disparate people are trapped in a country house, and obviously one of them's a murderer, and who done it? And as much as I love Chandler and Hammett, and I'm in awe to those kind of traditional noir writers, I'm also really fond of Agatha Christie, Dorothy L. Sayers. There's a writer called Marjorie Allingham, who I think is really, really underrated.
Yeah, she's brilliant.
Absolutely fantastic writer. And I wanted to draw on that tradition with the Red Hollow. And if I was talking about my life as a compost, the part of Nuneaton where I was born was once a village, and the Grand Manor House was bulldozed sometime in the 1920s, and the 1930s estate was built on it. And close to that village is a hamlet, and in that hamlet is a grand country house, which has a folklore going back to Boudicca. It has a folklore of women defending the manor house from Prince Rupert during the Civil War. So it was just basically the lady of the manor and her servants defending the manor against the Cavalier forces. And apparently he was so impressed with them, he stopped his bombardment, bowed to her, and then went down the A5 towards Leicester to ruin Leicester. So it has this lovely, lovely... Apparently Boudicca was defeated near there as well when she kind of came up the A5 and wanted revenge on the Romans for raping her daughters. So it's got a lovely folklore. And my dad told me a fantastic story about it. He said that it was the Church of England Temperance Society home for alcoholic men and addicted men and men who had shell shock. And during the 20s and 30s, but when they cleared out the house, they found a ton of empties in the roof. So it has this remarkable history, and I drew on that and I thought, yeah, I'm going to write about Caldicot Hall. I'm going to write about Caldicot Hall. And of course, once I got thinking about that and thinking about how I was going to isolate people, I realised that that home for men with addiction is a perfect place to set a country house mystery. That was kind of the inspiration for it.
it's also, I think it's a perfect read for this time of year, really. So due to just the setting and some of the themes in the book and some of the sort of supernatural type elements in it, you referred to some of the myths and folklore. So obviously there's quite a few there that are based on fact that you had. Was there any in there that surprised, that you found out that you didn't know before again? So any sort of ones that...
Oh, okay. So in the Red Hollow, there is the folklore about the mermaid. I call Calibre, this village, I base the Red Hollow on Red Hollow. And there's a myth about the mermaid. I actually wrote a folklore that's not published about the mermaid. And it was very, very... I wrote it in the style of an Edwardian folklorist. And it had that kind of Hound of the Baskervilles feel, where a young woman, just after the Civil War, was hunted down, sexually assaulted by the side of a pool, left to drown. And as she drowns, she curses all drunken men and all men who have been violent against women. And the folklore says that when the hamlet floods, and Nuneaton is on the watershed of England, so it floods all the time. So when the hamlet floods, she comes out as a ghostly mermaid, and she will attack any man who's been violent towards women. Now, that's not the folklore of Caldicot. It's actually a kind of folklore I've bastardised from a place called Blackmere Pool up in Staffordshire. There is a mermaid in Staffordshire, and the folklore around her is either she's a mermaid from the sea, a sailor from Staffordshire found her, fell in love with her, got tired of her, popped her in the lake, and she's constantly pining for this sailor who, literally dumped her in the lake. The other folklore is that she was a young woman. She was crossing the moors to sell her lace. She was obviously raped and murdered and dumped in the lake, and now she's a mermaid. And I was thinking about these kind of ideas of rape and murder, again, violence against women, how it appears in our folklore. And I thought, well, I'm going to steal Staffordshire's folklore and pop it into North Warwickshire. I'm sure they don't mind. Just to add a little bit to the existing folklore of the place. And that's why I anonymised it effectively, because obviously this is not the folklore of Caldicot. And I do have some readers who've been to the church to see if there is a mermaid pew. And the people are getting quite cross because it's a private church and they're not allowed to go and have a poke about, and there is no mermaid pew. I actually made it up. But yes, so I kind of inserted that watery folklore because I'm fascinated by the fact that actually Birmingham is very watery, and where I live is very watery, and yet we are the furthest away from the sea.
Have you not just inspired a load of people to go to church then? Is that not...
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely love churches, obsessed with churches. I have a kind of real Philip Larkin obsession with church going, and I love church architecture. So I really went to town on that.
Now, here at Calibre Audio, we're obviously all about making books accessible for people. So we're delighted that we've got both stories available as audiobooks, narrated by the fantastic Paul Della Ross. And well, I just wondered if you listened to any of them, actually, and if they add a different perspective to the story for you if you hear them read aloud.
Oh, yeah. Actually, it was the loveliest moment, I think, of being a debut writer. You don't get an awful lot of choice, when it comes to how they want to market the book or the book cover and things like that. I've got a fantastic book cover, it's amazing. But with the audio narration, they sent 3 examples of audio narration, a woman and 2 men. And the woman was absolutely lovely, and she had a lovely voice. She sounded a little bit like the poet Liz Berry. She had this lovely black country accent, but because William is a man, it sounded so. It didn't gel with me. The other guy, you could kind of tell he was putting on an accent. But Paul, when I heard Paul, I was like, oh, wow, it's William. It just sounded like William sounded in my head. And it was such a ta-da moment. It was actually a moment of real joy to hear him read.
Do you think as well, because he's got I thought he really sounded like, you could put him in a Philip Marlowe novel. He's so got that great voice for it. So he was just such a perfect match for your story.
Yeah, he's got a beautiful voice, obviously, because he's an actor and a voice actor, but he's got that really excellent downbeat, kind of hard-boiled narration, which is so good.
Did you go and get to see any of it being recorded or anything? Or
no, I didn't. No, they sent me clips over, and then I had to pay for it on Audible. So I had clips sent, but then I thought, oh no, I really need to listen to all of this. So I paid for my own book on Audible. I gave myself 5 stars.
That's fair enough, I think. Well, anyway, they're worth a listen because they are brilliant. They really brought the story to life for me. I mean, I'd read the books and then I went to the audio, and I think that's what's so great about it. It just gives you another perspective. So I had an image of William in my head, but Paul did something else for it. So I kind of changed my opinion a little bit. Now, you said that your love of reading has been inspired by your grandmother, who was an avid reader. Can you tell us about a book that you've read recently that you'd recommend, or even just an old favourite?
Oh, gosh, that's such a difficult question. I think a book that I've read recently and absolutely loved, this is going to seem so left field, but it's Ben McIntyre's book on Colditz. Such a great book. I suppose really I'm interested in human resilience. I once had a lovely review that Nida Sally was actually all about love, and I think that's absolutely true. And I think that's what was fantastic about the Colditz book. It was about resilience and humanity and love and friendship, and that really came through, as well as daring do. I love a bit of daring do. So yes, Ben McIntyre's book on Colditz, absolutely fantastic. I suppose my favourite book of all time, and one that I recommend a lot, is Angela Carter's Wise Children. If you like sassy women, and who doesn't? If you like sassy, resilient, fun women, Angela Carter's Wise Children is where to go to.
Now, going on to your other love of films and sort of the noir type, particularly film noir, and then the books that feature that as well. Your books are actually, I think, very filmic. So I don't know if you think that yourself, but obviously you admit you love films, particularly from this era. And as you write, are you also imagining how they might play out on the screen, and who would play William Garrett if that was the case?
Okay. So I'm a very visual. I have a very visual imagination. So when I write a scene, I see the scene and I hear the scene and I see it and hear it like a film playing out. And then I try and transfer what I can see in my imagination onto the page. I don't think every writer does it that way, but for me, it has to be, the geography of the scene has to be perfect and the detail of the scene has to be perfect. And I think that's because I'm a visual person. So I see the scene and I hear the scene before I even think about it in terms of prose. And then I kind of try and transfer that emotion of the scene into the prose. I'm a very visual person. Yeah, and I love film. And I'm absolutely obsessed with film of the period. And in terms of who will play William, I always say Rafe Spall.
Love Rafe Spall, yeah.
And
I was going to say Tom Hiddleston, but...
Oh, that's so interesting. Gosh, really? Oh my goodness, I've never had a Hiddleston before. Lots of people ask me this question when I do events, and I've never had a Hiddleston. That is really interesting.
But Rafe Spall's a great shout as well. I mean, I could totally...
Yeah, well, I thought Rafe
really
Spall,
well.
because he's just... what I like about Rafe, he's a fantastic actor. But what I like about him is he just looks like a normal bloke. Yeah. And I kind of like my normal bloke. So, for example... who who's that really handsome man? Tom, not Hiddleston. Hardy.
Yeah.
Lots of people say, oh, William's Tom Hardy, isn't he? And I'm like, in William's dreams. But so I didn't necessarily want to have a kind of really hunky guy. I just want a normal bloke.
Yeah, I'd go with roast ball. That's a good shout. I can imagine.
I'm going to go home and think of Hiddleston now.
You can have that one for free. Now, just going back into your background a little bit. So, I was reading that you were actually a teacher. Sort of, that's as you started out. So, how did the transition from teacher to writer come about? And is it easier standing up in front of a class or an audience of avid readers?
It's so much easier sitting and chatting with you. So much easier. I was a teacher for. I was a teacher and then I was a writer. I stopped teaching to do a creative writing MA. And I did a lot of private tuition while I was doing my MA to keep me going. And I did all sorts of things, like during COVID I was a track and trace. So I was one of those people who rang you all. But yeah, so I was an English teacher for a time, and then I did my creative writing MA. And now I'm a bookseller as well, so I kind of do anything I can to keep the writing going.
Do you put your books out front and centre on the shelves?
Do you know, I'm absolutely anonymous at work, but my colleagues, they're great and awful, because they're like, somebody comes in, they're like, oh, I'm looking for a new crime novel, and they'll go, oh, there's this fantastic one by Natalie Marlow. And I'm like, and I just feel like hiding in the cupboard. But
that's
yeah,
that's what you want.
But they sell my books for me, and they're really great. And then they kind of give me knowing looks. I've got one colleague who literally winks at me every time she sells one of my books. So yeah,
that's the best of both worlds, isn't it? If you could go back to when you first started writing, what advice do you think you'd give yourself, knowing what you do now, in terms of the writing process or getting published? Or indeed, what bit of advice would you give to aspiring writers, if you could?
Right, I think it's a difficult industry. So the only thing that you can keep hold of is that you're a writer, and that you should write what you want to write. Don't ever think that you should write for the market. Don't ever think that you should write for a particular readership. Don't go online and kind of access a bunch of rubbish about you should be doing this and this and that, because they don't know. Writing is an art and a craft, and it needs to come from the heart. And then if you are doing that, if you're kind of thinking about your craft seriously, writing about what you want to write, then you are a writer. Publication doesn't make you a writer. Writing makes you a writer. Publication is down to dumb luck. I was just lucky. And there are fantastic writers out there who are not yet published and may never be published, but it does not make them not writers. They are writing. There's a sense also that once you get the kind of I had a 2-book deal and I've got another 2-book deal. This is really good stuff, and I'm what they call well published. I've got a hardback publication and paperback publication, and I get the audiobook. That's well published. But I still have to work for a living, And there's still a lot of precarity in my life. What makes me a writer is that I write. So you write from the heart and you write what you want to write. And that's the only advice, really. Work on your craft.
Is that the most important thing? If you want to write, just write.
Oh, God. Oh, absolutely. It's the only advice. It's the only advice. And yes, listen to critique. If you've got trusted readers, listen to them. But then go with your gut. You're the writer, You're driving that car.
Was that something that helped? Because when you were doing your creative writing MA, did you have lots of sort of critical sort of scenarios and sessions where people could critique your work? So did that help on your...
Yeah, so I come from a workshopping background. So I went to the UEA and they do something, it's the Iowa workshop it's called. So you submit a couple of thousand words, perhaps 3,000 words per workshop in advance of that workshop. Other writers read it and they critique it in a circle. That is really valuable. Because if somebody says to you, so-and-so character's not working, and I think she should say this now, they're wrong. But they're also right. If you get several people saying, that character's not working, and you should do this, what you do know is the character's not working, but never take their advice. You know the character's not working. Thank you very much for letting me know. But then I'm going to try and sort out that issue with that character in my way. Because you have to have your own sort of fingerprints all over your work. So workshopping helps you find a kind of, if there's a consistency of error. So if the workshop agrees that a certain character is not working, it is not working. You've got some professional readers there, so you trust them. But never take the minutiae of their advice. Trust that they kind of know what they're saying, but you sort it out for yourself. It's your work. That helps you become resilient as well.
And so, talking about writing from your point of view, then, is there any chance you can give us a sneak peek of what's next on the horizon for William at all?
I've just submitted my third novel about a week ago. Oh boy, I'm kind of recovering from So it's called Death Comes as a Shadow. We're back in Birmingham this time. And I'd love to give you a précis of it, but my kind of head's all over the place. All I can say is that there's a parrot in it. He's called Mr. Ragtime O'Shea, and he really hates William. There's a music hall comedian called Little Dicky Bow, who are based on Larry Grayson. That's for the young people in the audience. The Queenie's back in it, and she's up to bad business. There's a cult, obviously, in Birmingham. So it's a kind of, it has a much lighter tone than The Red Hollow. I've written a 5-act comedy, I think. So obviously it's going to go through a massive structural edit. So if you're kind of going to be buying this in a year's time thinking it's going to be a 5-act comedy, it means that it's gone through such a structural edit. It's a really dark, horrific novel, because what happens in the structural edit means that oftentimes things get changed. So,
Is there any downside for you? So now you've just finished one. Do you immediately, you've got to, right, okay, here's the ideas for the next one, or can you, sort of come back together and think, right, I'm going to think about this a little bit and then start my next one in a little while?
So when I got my second deal, I had to submit a synopsis of 2 novels. I submitted, it was such a difficult time. I submitted The Red Hollow, the final edit, renegotiated the deal on the back of a synopsis that I hadn't, that I needed to write. So I needed to come up within a week after submitting that 2 synopses for the third and the fourth novel. So effectively the fourth novel is roughly planned. And I need to start it pretty soon to meet a deadline. And I think that's another bit of advice I'd like to give. If you do get a publishing deal, really think very carefully about if you can achieve your deadline and still have a reasonable quality of life. I've got my children in the audience today, and it's the first time I've seen them in absolute months because of this deadline. And I'm not a neglectful parent; they're actual adults, but so really think quite carefully about how you're going to negotiate your deadlines, because you do want a little bit of quality of life, and also you need to be able to fill your kind of creative cup a bit. But as soon as the edits for Death Comes of a Shadow are kind of in, I really am going to have to start on the fourth novel.
Wow, that's quite particularly when you work as well. That's trying to fit that in is unbelievable. Well, I've sort of I've kind of taken all your time really with this. So I'm gonna let the audience now see if they want to ask any questions to you. I'm gonna let this microphone go around. So does anyone have any questions at all? Because I'm gonna ask one of the lovely Calibre staff to go and take it to you so that we can. Has anyone got any questions for Natalie at all? Excellent. All right.
So I work in Birmingham City Centre, so I have such a strong affinity. I literally work next door to Needless Alley. I actually broke my ankle in Needless Alley at the beginning of this year, so it has a huge resonance. As I've been reading the book, I'm like, oh my gosh, like that's where I broke my ankle, that's where I've done this. So it's amazing. And also me and my mum have been sat here going, we're from Nuneaton, we do all these things. So it's been a huge, like, we love it. But I suppose my question is, like, where in contemporary Birmingham would you go to feel like the most connected to that era that you were writing about in kind of those 30s? Was there a spot in Birmingham you'd go to feel that connection?
I think they're filming Peaky Blinders there right now. I think it's Digbeth. Yeah. I think Digbeth still has... I really like Digbeth. It's got a lot of the feel of old Birmingham in it. I am old enough to remember kind of the Birmingham of the late 70s and early 80s as well. My dad was an upholsterer, and he used to work for M&B. So he was constantly in and out of Birmingham, and I would be like his little friend in his white van. And I would be constantly sitting outside of some Victorian warehouse in Nichols while he was picking up tacks or a compressor or something that he needed. And so I remember it. But I think Digbeth would be the place now to go to have that kind of... It's a very... I do it in Needless Alley, but it's the clay. It's that red Victorian brick that's so Birmingham. So all around Snow Hill into Digbeth.
Thank you so much. Oh my God, I'm completely obsessed with everything you're saying, honestly. I'm trying to soak everything in. I really appreciated when you talked about women's endurance as something you truly admire and respect. Would you say that's a part of how you define women's agency?
Oh, boy. Gosh, that's such a great question. Yeah, I do. And I think it's universal. I think women's resilience, it's a quiet resilience, it's universal, and it's throughout the ages. And I think women often experience our own power and our own resilience when we get together in our kind of circles. And I kind of experienced that power as a very young child with all of my aunties, my great aunties really, my grandma's sisters, who were really remarkable working class women. Basically they'd seen a lot of life and they knew how the world worked and they knew how to negotiate the world. And they knew how to rage against it as well when they were in the comfort of their own home. I think women's resilience is their kind of key characteristic. There's a sadness in that though, isn't there? Yeah, when we think that, that women are incredibly resilient, it's sad that we have to be.
To bring the tone down slightly from that, you've already said who you'd like to play William. Who would you have play Queenie or Phil or one of the other leading ladies?
Okay, so first, I'm not going to answer that question directly. Ronnie will be Andrew Scott. Oh, thank you. I had a small round of applause. That's. I just think that Andrew Scott would make a fantastic Ronnie. In my head, when I was writing it, it was the very young Cary Grant. Ronnie was the very young Cary Grant. Right, Phil. In my head, this is because I watch a lot of old movies, so my references, I'm hoping that people will get this, but in my head, Phil is Katharine Hepburn. Katharine Hepburn did a fantastic film with Cary Grant. Oh, Sylvia Scarlett, where she dressed as a boy throughout it. She looked absolutely amazing because she was Katharine Hepburn, but she's Phil in my head. Queenie in my head. In my head, she's the girl from Raised by Wolves. This was on the telly about 10 years ago. It was about Caitlin Moran's family in Wolverhampton, and the girl who played the Caitlin Moran character was this kind of dark-haired, sort of round-faced young woman. And in my head, that's Queenie. But then again, Queenie is based on my great-grandmother, and we are dark-haired, round-faced women. so I suppose that's where I got that kind of idea of her from.
Do your characters ever talk back to you? Do they say, I wouldn't say that, or I wouldn't do that, and you have to change?
Yeah. Oh, this is going to make me sound mad. Okay, these things often kind of devolve into a therapy session for me. I apologise. But when I was writing Death Comes as a Shadow, I was trying to write more of a standard detective book, where William actually does detecting, where he's a detective. But William doesn't like being a detective. He really hates asking questions. You know, where were you at 3 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday? He finds that quite boring. He just wants to take a lot of drugs and wander around Birmingham and read modern poetry. Which is unfortunate if you're a detective story writer. Finding a way for William, who is kind of a bit messed up, God bless him, to detect. When I wouldn't necessarily say he was a natural nosy Parker. His name is Marple. It's very difficult. So I have to whip him into shape. I have to say, come on, just do your job. And what I've actually done is in this next novel, I've got Queenie and Phil voicing that, where Queenie actually calls him Shit Sherlock. She's like, come on, Shit Sherlock, I don't have to do, your job for you. And I thought, oh, that's me telling William to book himself up a bit. But yes, he really hates it. He finds it quite boring. He just likes to do his own thing. But yeah, that's the madness of being a writer, I think.
Natalie, well, thank you very much for those questions. They were fantastic. And Natalie, I just want to say, on behalf of all of us, thank you very much for what's been an absolutely enthralling and entertaining evening, particularly about hearing some of the, the local history and the reasons behind you writing the stories as well. So can everybody just give Natalie a massive round of applause for coming to us there? Thank you very much. Now, she's also going to help me because earlier on I mentioned about the inclusive... Oh, they've gone on there, sorry. So the Inclusive Voices competition that we had. And we are going to announce the winners and give the prizes. So can I ask one of the Calibre staff just to come up and give me a hand just for 2 seconds? If that's all right. Thank you, Amy. So... Thank you. Right. So earlier I mentioned our Inclusive Voices short story competition, which ran from March to August this year and was open to all ages and abilities. Entries could be submitted in any format, so written, audio or video. It could be story, poetry or play format, and it had to be 550 words or less and feature a character with a print disability. We were thrilled to have 121 entrants across all age categories for this, and we thoroughly enjoyed reading through all the submissions along with our fantastic panel of judges, who were author Catherine McMahon, Dave Steele, the blind poet, and Joe Haddo, a children's author, radio producer and podcast host. They couldn't be here this evening, but I am thrilled to say that one of the children's judges is here, and that's Dave Shelton. So give a wave, Dave. Thank you very much for that. So Dave very kindly helped us to judge the children's competition. And all of the judges gave up their time really freely to take part, without whom we couldn't have done this. So we're incredibly appreciative of their support as well. I am delighted to say that 3 of the winners in the adults age categories have been able to come today, so we can give them their prize to them. So firstly, I'd like to announce our second place winner in the 18 to 25 age category, who is Nasiba Meshkat, with her story, Mountains Under My Fingers. Now, Nasiba's story, which is a powerful narrative in which the main character loses their sight in a bomb blast, which also takes their home and possessions, including their books. Whilst living in a temporary shelter, the main character is given some braille books, which at first seems insurmountable, with the raised dots seeming like mountains to climb. But gradually, to quote from the story, the dots felt less like mountains and more like steps leading me somewhere. The judges said Nusaiba's story was compelling and deeply moving, And the combination of emotional weight and the protagonist's journey of rediscovery and hope makes this to stand out as a complete and impactful story. So I'd love for you all to give a massive round of applause to Nusaybah, and can I ask her to come up to the stage and receive her prize from Natalie, please? Thank you. So next, I'd like to announce our third place winner in the 18 to 25 age category, and that goes to Hannah Middleton with her story that's called Knocked Off My Feet. This is about Jane, who's running late to meet her mother for a coffee. So her and her guide dog, Artie, are rushing to get there when a girl called Abby bumps into her and quite literally knocks her off her feet in what the film world would probably call a perfect meet-cute situation. This story had heart and humour, and the judges said it was a delightful and heartwarming read with an uplifting tone, and the dialogue and the dynamic between the two characters make it enjoyable. So again, please, can we have a round of applause for Hannah, and can I ask her to come up to the stage to receive her prize from Natalie as well? Thank you. And finally, I'd like to announce our second place winner in the 26 and over age category, and that goes to Elizabeth Pywell with her story, The Cornish Countryside. The main character in this story is living with dementia, and we follow her as she reminisces about riding motorbikes in the Cornish countryside whilst experiencing the stark realities of her memory loss and disorientation. As she remembers, she has to write a birthday card to her granddaughter, only to not recognise what it is a few minutes later. The judges said the story was very clever and heartbreaking, sad and well written. So please can we have a round of applause for Elizabeth, and can I ask her to come up to the stage to receive her prize from Natalie as well. Thank you very much. So just before we let you go and come and meet Natalie and get your book signed, so Natalie will be signing at the table here. Can I just remind you to fill in your feedback forms that you're given on the way in and hand them back to a member of staff before you leave, please? This just really helps us improve and plan for future events, so it's really valuable if you can do that for us. So book selling and any of your Christmas merchandise, if you want to get going with it on there, is to the table here next to the right of me. But thank you very much, all of you, for coming and supporting us today. And lastly, can I ask you all to join me in giving one more big thank you of applause to Natalie Marlow for such a brilliant evening.